Okay, great. So thank you. So today in Composition Symposium, we have Dr. Michael Fiday. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day for this interview. Um, I'm going to start off with a few
Thank you so much.
questions relating to your piece, Slapback for electric guitar and delay unit.
Mhm.
I'm an electric guitarist myself, so I was
Oh,
eager to ask you questions about this.
sure.
So the first question that we have from students is, the effect in Slapback strikes me as very similar to a couple of the 9 haiku for flute and piano. Could you talk about your approach to temporal effects in music?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of funny how that came about. So for those of you who might not know, there's an effect in most of what Slapback is about. Is you hear the piece and only 50% of the notes that you're hearing are actually played by the performer. The other notes are being answered by the delay system, which is set to only one slapback or rebound or reverberation. And so it's like playing kind of a very close canon with oneself. And it's very similar to an effect that I use in 2 of the movements of 9 haiku, the second haiku, and also the second to last one, the second and the eighth, which are basically the same piece, only varied. And the influence for Slapback, of course, came first. I wrote that in 1997. And 9 haiku, I think, followed about 10 years later. But the influence for that specific technique in Slapback came through 2 different directions. One was the guitarist I was working with at the time, who was a man by the name of John Tamburello, who was at that time a guitarist, electric guitarist in Minnesota. I believe he lives in Wisconsin now. I haven't been in touch with him for a long time. But the collaborative process with him began by me just driving out to St. Paul, Minnesota in the dead of winter. And working with him, and he just showing me what the electric guitar was about, what the different kind of effects that he had. And one of the things that he happened to mention was, oh, I've also got this delay effect. And then I got this idea, and it came from a number of different sources. One was just to write a piece based on that technique, and that technique all alone. And part of that was actually from, at the time I was, it was an opportunity for me to go and listen to a lot of my rock records and dug out a number of different things, but I settled on recording of The Who live at Leeds. And there's one extended big long solo that Pete Townsend plays, and which the liner notes refer to him playing a chord, and it bounces back off the walls of the auditorium, and he kind of answers that. He answers his own echo and creates kind of a little duet based on this kind of back and forth of the echo. At the same time, years before that, I was on a Fulbright in Amsterdam, working with the great Dutch composer Louis Andriessen, and was exposed, as many of us were, to a piece by the name of Hout for quartet. It's for, marimba, piano, saxophone, and electric guitar. And for the piece has become kind of a classic now. But at that time, it was brand new. And I just happened, there was a documentary being made about him for the BBC, and in which they were filming a performance of this relatively newly composed piece. I think it was only about a year old at that point. And all of us kind of hearing it for the first time later in performance and just going, oh my God, this is so cool. And so that, as the years have gone on, that particular technique of the close canon at the 16th note
it's like Frere Jacques kind of compressed into a little space, has been a very important technique for me. And it surfaced in Slapback, and it surfaced in those two particular movements in Nine Haiku. And it's since become kind of a technique that I use in some passages of my other pieces as well. So that's kind of where it came from.
Cool. And then like a follow-up question to that is, and maybe you kind of already answered this, I guess, in a way, is how did you plan out the counterpoint caused by the delay in Slapback? Or was it just kind of generated from the delay effects?
Oh, you mean when I was composing it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. What I did is I forgot if basically what I did is I ended up purchasing a Korg sound module, which was this little black box. You know, it's a synthesizer, and it had all kinds of sounds in it, just about every conceivable instrument, and it had a fairly decent electric guitar sound that worked for my purposes. And you could go into the patch itself and control the delay. So I backed off the delay so that it was only bum bum, you know, one rebound, and that the second one was of equal volume and all that. So, and I don't remember if I got this piece of hardware specifically to write the piece, or I started writing the piece and started just the old-fashioned way, trying to write counterpoint, and, you know, threw up my hands. Oh, this isn't going to work. I need the technology. But I will say that it's like I couldn't have written that piece or come up with some of the effects in that piece had I not had that little bit of technology there. And some of it was, you know, just experimenting and improvising at the keyboard. You know, it's like, okay, it's in this tempo, you know, and then driving triplets against that, and which creates this kind of wild flanging effect. Like all those kind of things were discoveries that were made through improvisation with the technology.
Awesome. So as a guitarist myself, I was listening to that piece and I was under the impression that you were a guitarist, just from the way that it was written. But I'm wondering now, did you kind of run into any issues writing for the guitar? Were there any obstacles? I've heard that the guitar is difficult to write for non-guitarists, but I don't know if that's a universal thing necessarily.
Yeah, it's pretty universal, except for guitarist composers, I suppose. And yeah, I was not apprehensive about it, but yeah, it's not like writing for B-flat clarinet, let's say. And I think, you know, when I first started writing the piece, you know, I thought, well, it's my first time writing for guitar at all, so why don't you keep it simple? Why don't you just write all single lines? And just, you know, you can still write a good piece that does that, and give them plenty to do, and making my life easier. And boy, did that idea not last long. It ended up being like the first idea that I had was this big kind of Townsend-esque chordal pattern, you know, complete with harmonics and everything like that. And then I was off and running. So, okay, well, there's going to be a lot of chords in this, and I'm going to have to figure out where fingers go and how to voice these chords. And I think, you know, what saves me is I'm a little bit of a guitarist. I'm a terrible one, and I only know how to play, you know, like the usual cowboy chords, so I can play all my favorite songs and all that sort of stuff. But I have a little familiarity with it, and also at that time I did have a guitar in my apartment that I could, you know, write down chords and then check it out and just make sure that it was playable. And also the thing is, I do have a background. My main instrument was violin. So I think even string players, they have a jump start on writing for guitar,
just because of the issue of hand patterns with chords is, an important one that you have to take note of. And I just ended up doing what I think a lot of people who aren't string players do when they're writing for a violin or cello or bass is I put a little graph on my wall of the fretboard and the strings, and I'd play a chord at the piano and then try and figure out where on the strings the fingers would be put and see if they're in a pattern that is possible, and did it that way. And I got good feedback. Actually, the person who premiered the piece was not John Tamburello. He played it later, but was a guitarist by, you might be familiar with this name, Parker. Are you familiar with Seth Giselle?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, he's an American guitarist living in Berlin, just an incredible player who's really made some really important recordings on the electric guitar and kind of advanced the idea of electric guitar being a viable contemporary music instrument. And so I sent that to Seth, and he's the first one who kind of really took it under his wing and played it a lot and later recorded it. And I felt very proud later on when we did a radio interview about the piece, and he described the writing for the piece as being very idiomatic but also very fearless, and so I felt good about that, because here was this piece that I had some apprehension about, and like I said, let's just write single lines or let's freak myself out, and just kind of went whole hog into it, but relying on my experience as a string player to help me, and ended up writing a piece that's very difficult but also gives some thought to what the guitarist has to do. So
Great. Well, I'm gonna pass things over to Eli, if he's ready.
Hi, Eli.
Hi, sure thing. Am I coming through clearly? I had a little bit of an unstable internet connection for a minute there, so
you're good.
hopefully I won't break up.
You're loud and clear.
Good. So I was going to ask in about, we had a few people wondering about the orchestration in 3-for-1. So sort of to start off broadly, could you tell us about the approach and why you decided to focus on those different instrument groups and their different colors in writing that piece?
Yeah. Part of it has to do with, I guess it's, the orchestration in that piece is not necessarily anything novel or unidiomatic or anything, but it does have certain aspects to it that might be different from some pieces, which is that, instead of a lot of solo work, there is a lot of thinking in terms of the choirs, the different sections of the orchestra and how they work well with one another. And this was kind of a product of the commission. It was the commission that was offered by Cincinnati Symphony was to be part of this series that they had called One City, One Symphony. And we were supposed to come up with, each of us who got these commissions were trying to, told to think of some way into the idea of the cohesiveness of one city, one symphony. And I think this particular concert was one of the worst possible weekends. It was the weekend, it premiered the weekend after Thanksgiving. So, but the idea was people are coming home from Thanksgiving, so it was supposed to have something to do with homecoming or something. It's just one of these things where a commissioner gives you all these ideas and then you write whatever the hell you wanted. No, just kidding. No, there was some aspect of that I tried to take to heart. And I think it was at that point, especially with the political situation in the air at that time, because Trump had just been elected president not long before that. And so I started thinking about community and viewing this orchestra as not a group of individuals all going off doing their own thing, but a group that was trying to be cohesive and communicating with one another kind of towards a common cause. And I wanted, and it was especially kind of, that was especially important to me because this was an orchestra that whose members, a number of them I'd become friends with over the something like the 13 years before that, ever since I came to Cincinnati. So I couldn't think of that group in a non-personal way because I knew so many of them. And I wanted to treat the group as kind of a community. And so there's kind of a sense of solidarity that they all have, yet at the same time, each movement features a different group. So the first movement is kind of focused on the woodwinds as the core, and the other members of the orchestra kind of coming in to support that later on. The second movement based mostly around the strings. And then the last movement centers on predominantly on the brass.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had one of our class members that was wondering about the way that you approached incorporating the percussion in different ways through those groups, sort of as not a focus, but especially in the second movement, the way the strings and the harp and percussion all sort of sounded together struck them as particularly beautiful.
Oh, no, that's a very nice comment. Yeah, I liked the way that second movement worked out. It's actually kind of one of my favorites of the set, and I think, you know, when I approached that movement, I wanted it to be predominantly for strings. And, you know, and I don't know, you know, if you know, any of your students were noticed in the program notes to the score that this is actually based on a previous piece of mine called 5 Monochromatic Dances. It was originally for recorder quartet, and then it was for flute quartet. That's the version that's been the most played. And I decided to take movements from that and make orchestral versions of them. So that particular slow movement, the original, you know, right away I thought would lend itself well to strings. And so most of that is just almost a verbatim kind of setting of the original, you know, with the 4 voices and you know, the violins, viola, and cello, but then adding a bass line to it at various points. And then, so that's, if you had only that, then what you would have is almost verbatim, with the exception of the bass line. You would have the same thing as what you had in the flute quartet. But then what I decided was, wouldn't it be nice between each of these phrases, because it's, I think, like 3 or 4 phrases, and the first one goes this far, the second one casts out, is at another transpositional level, I think a 5th up, and then it casts even further up, and then the last one, you know, kind of goes all the way to top and then whistles down. That's the form of it. So I had this idea of, wouldn't it be cool between each of these repetitions to just insert this kind of very poignant I don't know how to describe it, you know, kind of shimmery sort of music in the vibes and piano in unison. And just that kind of harmonically, just a little statement that comments harmonically on what went before. And added to that is, there's a thread that goes through the entire movement, which is this, what is it? A Thai bull gong, you know, and it's one of these, got one over there. I won't reach for it, but it's just, you know, this bowl that you have like a little friction stick that you roll around inside, and after a while it starts to hum. Yeah, very similar to having a crystal glass that you rub your hand over. And this goes out through the entire movement. And I was happy with that effect because you hear it at the start a little bit. We had to get it amplified. It's not loud enough on its own, so we had to mic it. And but you hear a little bit at the beginning, and then as the string texture starts to fill out, it disappears. But then in those moments where the strings kind of drop out and you hear the percussion, you can hear it accompanying those chords. And you know, it was kind of a very nice effect that I was happy with. So that's how it came about, is just kind of a very simple addition to a structure that I already had.
Thank you. So I was also going to ask about a little bit about poetry and the haiku. In both the 9 haiku and Dharma Pops, you sort of described these different kinds of short form poetry as a big part of the piece. And so we were wondering if you could just describe your relationship with poetry a little bit more and how it influences your composition.
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, first, I mean, it's like most composers say this, that, you know, especially after writing instrumental music, working with poetry, whether it's an instrumental kind of evocation of the text, or a song, you know, where you're setting a text to a vocal part, is kind of a big relief because you know, instrumental music, you have to just kind of build your own form up from the ground up, and you know, and it's fun, but it's a lot of work. Whereas you work with text, or first, if you're setting a song and you have a full, you know, poem, you have a form that's already suggested to you and something to work against. You can take liberties with it if you want to, or you could, you know, be faithful to it. So I think the 9 haiku, there's kind of those two pieces. I'm glad you mentioned those. They're kind of brother and sister in a way, because they were written one after another, and they're kind of in response to one another a bit. And I can talk a little bit about each. The 9 haiku is in a lot of my process when I'm beginning a piece, like I get asked to write a piece or I get a commission or whatnot. I'm not one of these people that can just sit down and start writing anything. I need to have something that kind of catapults me into a creative world. Like if you view creative activity as like a circle, and within the circle, there's all these, you know, synapses firing and you know, things bouncing off one another. You know, all this activity that goes on that gets you really brainstorming things and writing down interesting ideas that exists there. You need something that's going to catapult you into it, kind of launch you into the process. And it's been a lot of different things for different pieces, but this particular one, I started off with the idea of writing a series of short pieces for flute and piano. And by the way, I have to say that when I got asked to write this piece and I heard flute and piano, I just went, oh my God, please, God save me now, because it's, it's just, we all have our biases, but the kind of old traditional thing of solo instrument with piano accompaniment just bores me. So I had to find some way of making that interesting to me. And one part of this was, I think I did a lot of things. I just went to a bookstore and I found a book of photographs, and I was thinking, well, why not write, I like this photography, why not write a series of pieces based on, you know, instrumental evocations of these photographs. And then somehow I stumbled on, I had at home this little book of Zen poetry. and I started looking through it. And of those poems, the ones that stood out to me the most and kind of resonated with me the most powerfully were those by Matsuo Basho, who is like kind of one of the king of Japanese poetry. He's like a real master of the form. And so I went and got a book of his poems and started reading them. And I think I whittled it down to like a short list of 25 haiku that I liked. And as I started whittling it down more, these poems started to organize themselves into categories, and it ended up being 9 that suggest the form of that piece, which is, here's 2 texts. One has to do with beginnings, like the beginning of art, I think is the first line. And then another one, which was Basho's death poem. So that's going to be the last in the set. And those 2 are both going to deal with the same music. And then there were other kind of categories, poems that had to do with bells, 2 that had to do with moonlight, 2 that had to do with birds, etc., or maybe 3 that had to do with birds. And it all kind of suggested this symmetry of how I organize the text in such a way that kind of represents a kind of the life cycle that Basho writes about in his poems. So then, it's I'm responding to the process is I'm responding to the text in the same way that composers do who are setting songs in setting text to vocal music, which is I look for things that give me musical ideas or coloristic ideas, just images that shine or that kind of give me an idea of a musical texture or whatnot. That's one way of doing it, but there are also other ways. One thing I'm just thinking of now is in one of the slower movements, I think it's the 4th or the 6th, I think it's the 6th movement. What I ended up doing was taking the text of the poem and setting a melodic line for the flute that was actually a vocal line. So it's like I set it like a song, complete with writing text underneath it. And then I erased the text and, added a few ornaments and stuff like that. But so that's kind of the way I dealt with the text in that particular piece. So the thing with Dharma Pops, now there's kind of a funny story about Dharma Pops because so I write 9 haiku. It gets a performance during our summer festival at CCM that we used to have. And a friend of mine, Alan Oddie, who is was on the percussion faculty at CCM. He's since retired. He came up to me and he said, those are very nice pieces, but they're too long to be haiku. And he's not talking about the one that's there's one that's 15-second long. He was fine with that one, but the rest of them he felt they were too long. So I decided, okay, I'm going to get him. I'm going to write some real haiku next. So again, I had a chance to write for Duo Galandis, Swedish violin duo, or husband and wife, and I liked the process of working with the haiku. And wanted to do it again. And I had these texts by Jack Kerouac. And so I decided, partly it was kind of my vendetta against Alan to write really short pieces, but it ended up being an interesting exercise because, and it was consistent with Kerouac's idea of these poems, which are meant to be just, the pops are like thoughts that pop into mind, like flashes of intuition. And he's just, something is happening that he observes in the natural world. and he just writes down this very quick reaction to it, doesn't edit it. There it is. And I wanted to do something where I could do something similar to that in my response to his poems. And one of the, so they're very quick kind of reactions to the text. Some of them have kind of in jokes, like there's one, Bach through an open dawn window, the birds are silent. And there's kind of a jazz subtext that goes, a bebop subtext that goes throughout the piece, having to do with Charlie Parker. So one of the ideas is taken from the Bach double concerto for 2 violins, but it's the last movement, but it's with notes erased. And then another idea, which is are some Charlie Parker licks played by both violins, but they're only fingered. They're not actually played. You can hear the fingers rustling around. So it's kind of like a little, somewhat corny joke about, Bach not being able to be quite heard, and then the bird are silenced as Charlie Yardbird Parker and stuff like that. But one of the things that was kind of interesting about that piece was I started writing, and then so I'd write some ideas and say, okay, that's a nice idea, but it's too long. This is turning out to be another 3-minute piece. It can't be a 3-minute piece. So take this idea and get it down. No, it's still too long. And then I just came up with this really simple, self-evident idea, which is it's got to be able to fit on a page. And I thought, why have I never thought about this before? Why do we never think about the page that we're working on and what fits on it? We're always thinking, oh, the idea has to be long as it is, and however many pages that is, so what? Why don't we think like journalists, or critics? It has to be 1 to 2 pages or something like that, or a painter, it has to be within a canvas. So I started thinking about, what I could fit on 1 page of manuscript for 2 violins, and that helped a lot. So, and then it got to be premiered, and I got to, in the talk about the piece, I got to tell the Alan Oddie story, so everybody laughed and had a good time with it.
Thank you. Yeah, the follow-up question of that sort of was something you already touched on there, but other than, that page limit idea, are there other ways you like to approach writing for smaller durations, like these 2 pieces?
Other approaches to writing in smaller durations. Yeah, well, one of the things is if you're writing a set of smaller pieces, which mostly they will be, unless it's one of those, those contests that used to be all the rage where, we're commissioning a bunch of composers to write a 1-minute long piece. You're talking about the pieces being part of a set. So how do you approach the pieces being played together in sequence? And what I liked about, again, this brother-sister relationship between 9 Haiku and Dharma Pops is they're both very different in that approach. So the 9 Haiku are very integrated. There's they have to be played in this order, and there's kind of a accumulation that you feel as the set goes on because of how it's constructed, not only in terms of the ideas, but also harmonically, because they're each built on kind of a pitch center that rises and then comes back around again, as opposed to Dharma Pops, which I tried my best to not think of what the other pieces were doing, and they each had to be their own separate kind of self-contained thing, and they could be played in any order. So, but I think in either case, especially in the case of Dharma Pops, what I like about I find really gratifying about writing in miniature forms is the idea of self-containment, that the ideas have to be very short but powerful in some way or another. And, you know, what would be an opening, you know, 3-bar phrase or something has to be something that lasts like a bar or 2 at most long, and has to be very succinct. And, you know, to be able to kind of create a whole shape that may have as much depth and meaning as a 20-minute long piece in just this one short span of time, go as many different places as possible in that short amount of time, is really cool. And you can't beat the instant gratification. And then one of the other things is just the role that your own standards and kind of sense of perfectionism can take hold, because you can really take just one little thing and just, it can be like gem cutting. You know, you can lavish all sorts of amount of time making that one little thing as nice as possible, and then you get to hear it right away, and it doesn't take you a month to write. So, but it's an assignment that I give to a lot of my private students sometimes when they're if they're struggling with long forms, and they are you know, starting off writing a piece and they're getting lost and they abandon a piece or something like that, I'll just have them back off and say, look, we need to work on just taking stock of your material, and let's work with very short pieces. And here are some examples, you know, everything from Webern, of course, who's the king of writing miniatures, to George Crumb, even though they're bigger pieces, they're made up of little moments, to Mark Mellitz, you know, post-minimalist composer who's very good at writing minimalist miniatures. And look at all the different things you can do in these very different styles and still get something out of it. And, you know, and it ain't easy. It's, you know, very difficult to make it work. And it's this idea of self-containment.
Thank you. I think that was the end of what I had written down for my section. So appreciate it and pass it off.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you for your answer towards the question from Eli. And
You're welcome.
the questions I have here are based on the perspective of the extended techniques in your music. And one of the questions from our classmates is about a piece, Jim and John, where you have wonderful extended techniques of flute in your piece. And the student is asking, sometimes when you describe this technique in your performance note, it can be a bit trickier to explain this into words. And the question is about how do you explain this and trying to make it clear to the performer?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I struggle with this with my students all the time, because I don't know about you guys, but it's like extended techniques are really the stuff these days. You know, the students really like to use them, and rightly so. They're a lot of fun. But you know, I see everything from, you know, just like a symbol that's not explained, and so they're not going to know what to do, or it's explained poorly or not enough in detail in prose, and then you ask them, well, how do they know you know, what to do in this passage? And they'll say, well, I worked with them on it and they said they can do it. Say, well, yeah, that's because you're at a conservatory and you can knock on their practice room door. But what happens when you take this piece and send it off to a flutist in Fargo, North Dakota, and they have no idea, you know, what you're talking about. So this is very important. And I think in the case, first of all, I'm very careful with extended techniques and how they're described and what directions I give to them. I always have been in my music. It's, you know, I've been using them for years. And part of it is being under the influence of George Crumb and having studied with him. And, you know, just kind of, you learn from the best. And if you look at his descriptions and definitions of these techniques that are used in like the macrocosmos for piano and whatnot, they're very specific and they're to the letter, and they give the performer all the information that they need to know to replicate those sounds accurately. But at the same time, they're also very concise. And I think there's a certain art to writing these descriptions of the techniques for the performers. They have to be contain all the right information, but they have to be short. You know, you can't write like an extensive essay on how to play tongue rams. So now with Jim and John, this was a piece that was a commission from the National Flute Association for their Young Artist Competition. And the way it works is a composer is chosen. So your Professor Ricardo Zone-Muldoon was also given this commission years ago as well, so he can tell you all about it. But it's basically, you write this piece, and it's premiered by one of the adult members of the National Flute Association. In my case, a wonderful flutist, Lisa Boast, premiered it, and she's the one on the recording. And but then, you know, you show up earlier in the morning, and there are I think like half a dozen flautists playing I think three different pieces, and your piece is the new one, the 21st century piece, and you know, kind of comparing how they all play it, and then one of the students is chosen as kind of the best interpretation of your piece and is given an award for that, and etc. And so anyway, this whole process of writing that piece was kind of, there was some editorial advice along the way, because what they do is they assign you to a flautist who is associated with National Flute Association and this commission, and that person is kind of your advisor. So you draft ideas, you send them to them, they make comments and give you some feedback. And in my case, it was fortunate. It was my friend Molly Barth, who is a fantastic flutist, used to play with Eighth Blackbird, and teaches at Vanderbilt now, is doing terrific work as a soloist. And she was very good about it. Well, first of all, you know, you kind of have to do this because it's going to a bunch of very, very talented kind of cream of the crop students, you know, everywhere from their late teens up through maybe their first year of grad school. And they have teachers. So you can't just like unilaterally write something impossible and send it along and get their teachers really pissed off at you. So it was kind of this constant working relationship that I developed with Molly Barth in terms of drafting up certain things that use these effects. And I wanted to write a piece that was difficult. I was encouraged to write something that was virtuosic, because they're really good players, and encouraged to write something that's put them out on the edge and really challenge them. So I wanted to do that. That's what I would like to do anyway. And so there were certain things I would send her, like I think there's that center section of the piece that focuses mostly on only the drumming kind of timbres that you have, the special techniques, and some of the regular notes start to bubble through the surface. And I think I had something that was way too fast, and she just sent it back and said, this is just virtually impossible. I can't play it with 2 hours of practicing on it. So these students can't, so you need to do something about this. So it was good to have that kind of feedback and know what the boundary was so that I could press against it and sometimes go over it a little bit. And by the time we finished it, Molly had told me, you know, it's like, I think it's really good. It's very challenging. It's very playing, and you will get some, and we will get some complaints about it. and they did. Some teachers, I think, were really down for it, and others were just like, oh, you know, it's. So, you know, all the flutists who played it, I mean, some got it better than others, but it took them into territory that I think they probably learned a lot from. And one student in particular, the one that won the award, was flutist Mira McGrill, and she did a fantastic job on it.
Yeah, yeah. And as a composer these days, using extended technique has sort of become a standard requirement, sort of in pieces. But extended technique sometimes can be rather an unfamiliar field for some performers. And I'm curious, what are the solutions when you have a large amount of techniques in one piece? And what are the best way of introducing this to the performer, and eventually they can become fluent using this technique?
Yeah, boy, that's a hard question. I think it depends on who you're writing for. You know, so if you're writing for a flautist, you know, say you should get a commission from Robert Dick or you know, Anne LaBarge and or Anne LaBerge in Amsterdam, who, you know, any of these flutists who specialize in really difficult music and have really mastered extended techniques, then you better bring your game. You know, you have to really kind of be pressing the boundaries at all times. Now, I think one way to answer that question is, which I've already answered, is that I don't like, and I encourage my students not to think of writing a piece of music as some thing in and of itself. You write for people, don't write for the instruments, write for people. That's what Louis Andriessen used to tell us. And so if you, because that context means everything. So if you're writing for somebody like Anne LaBerge, you really kind of make sure you've done your homework on how to work with these techniques and really challenge somebody who is already played some really challenging stuff. Now, on the other end of the continuum, if you're writing, say, for a very talented classmate of yours who's a freshman and plays very well but has never played anything, then you want to think about how you're going to introduce them to that world. And that can be done, you know, just brainstorming off the top of my head. There's number of ways that you can approach that. You could write a mostly kind of traditional sounding piece that gradually introduces these techniques into the musical fabric. You could write a group of short character sketches with each one of them devoted to a specific extended technique, you know, sort of like etudes for them, you know. And so there's number of ways of doing that. And it all has to be with regard to the context of, you know, how experienced the player is, what their frame of reference for this kind of thing is. But one thing I would say, and this is something that I talk with my students about too, is whatever techniques you use, make them meaningful, make them musical, make them say something expressive or dramatic. You know, a lot of us of my generation of composers and earlier, we remember this. David can probably speak to this. We were familiar with all these pieces that I called them catalog pieces. They were these awful pieces for, and there were a slew of them for solo instruments, that the pieces only function were to show off all these techniques. And you got, here's a multiphonic, here's a finger click, blah, 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 blah. And it just, they all sounded the same. They didn't really have anything to say. So I think that it's important. You have to have a reason why you want the specific sound and think about what is that saying expressively. So I think that's the only thing that I ask when I'm talking with my students about these kind of things.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And I think the last question I have to wrap this up is that actually a question for myself. As a composer, I love to explore like the possibility of sound on the instrument. And the way I often to do this is to actually whether purpose the instrument if I can, or like ask the instrumentalist. But I wonder, what are your ways of exploring sound qualities on the instrument? And because I noticed that there are wonderful like techniques on the flute that you use, I wonder how you get it from, sort of.
Yeah. Again, going back to 9 Haiku, and it's kind of funny, my relationship with flute music, because I've always liked the flute. It's never been one of my favorite, neither my favorite instrument or my non-favorite instrument. It's a good instrument, you know. I listened to a lot of Jethro Tull when I was younger. I loved the flute. So, but it's something I kind of fell into, because when I came here, there was a Dutch pianist and flutist that came through, and I became friendly with them and wanted to write a piece for them. That's how 9 Haiku came about. And part of what I described earlier of wanting to do something than the same old in terms of a soloist with a piano accompaniment. What I wanted to do is I wanted to find out what kind of sounds the piano, not only the flute, but the flute and the piano could make that were cognates that kind of communicated with one another. And that's how I came up with this idea of the muted notes on the piano, funk, and with the tongue rams in the flute, which are, that kind of thing. And, so that's how that opening movement came about. But I think in terms of exploring getting back to flute music, what's happened is after that piece, then as a result of that, I ended up writing probably a half a dozen flute works, and they're like, I'm mostly self-published, but the only pieces that are published are by this flute publisher in Spain. And so, kind of unwittingly have been known for writing these small group of flute compositions. And, and I'm not a flutist, but, that whatever, I like writing for them and come to like and become very familiar with the sound of the instrument. But how I approach the capabilities of sound possibilities for any given instrument, if I want to use special techniques, is first of all, and this is really important, is I meet with the performer and I just quiz them on, what different kind of things can you do? And I have some ideas that I've researched and know they can do. So I want them to demonstrate to me how they work. And are there things that they know about that I'm not familiar with that they can hit me to? So they'll show me that. And then that way, I'm not making the mistake that I find a number of younger composers making, is they just imagine these things without any kind of basis for how the sounds are produced and what makes them possible. And they can end up writing pieces that, again, aren't very well explained, so the performer doesn't know what to do, or they're impossible. because they're too fast or they don't have preparation to make the sound or whatnot. So the grounding and the actual, again, right for the people, not for the instrument. Meet with your performers and get some grounding on this before you go forward. Then once I have an idea of what the sound possibilities are, I just get out a piece of paper and I write down like a grocery list of what all these different effects are. And I stare at it and I try and see if it suggests something to me. Are some of these sounds, are some of them I love, some of them I'm not that interested in, or maybe they would work better in another piece, so I cross them out. And then another thing is, do some of these sounds relate? I'll put brackets around like a group of 3 or 4 different kinds of special techniques that might have something in common, or that if you progress from one to another, it would make sense. And also just what kind of music, when I think about these sounds, what kind of music does it elicit in my imagination? And that way, before I go in, I have kind of at least an idea of the sound capability and the expressive capability of these sounds. So I think that's what I've used for this kind of process anyway.
Thanks for your answer. This is very helpful. I think I'm definitely gonna work like you do whenever I write extended technique in the future.
Sure. Well, I'm glad it was helpful when you first said, I have a question for myself. I wasn't sure I was comfortable answering your question to yourself. So.
Well, great. Thank you so much again for answering all these questions. I think we've reached the end of the session, but did Eli or Zhihao, did either of you have any final remarks or comments? Okay. Well, great.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed meeting all of you, and best of luck. It must be needless to say, a kind of strange first semester for you there. We're having that with our students too. So I hope before too long, you're able to go up and down the grand staircase of Eastman School of Music very sooner rather than later.